Hello, everyone. Welcome to Net Diligence Virtual Cyber Risk Summit. My name is Heather Osborne, and I'm the Director of Global Events and Programming at Net Diligence, a cyber risk assessment and data breach services company. Net Diligence is pleased to bring our thought-leading content to the virtual space with this new webinar series. Visit our website at www.netdiligence.com to get more information about our upcoming webinars and in-person events. Before we begin, I'd like to extend our heartfelt gratitude to our virtual Cyber Risk Summit sponsors, particularly Aspen Insurance, our diamond sponsor. I'd also like to thank our 100-plus speakers for bringing their thought leadership to our program. For today's webinar, we will be using the ON24 platform. Right now, you should be viewing the ON24 dashboard, which shows the live viewing screen. During the webcast, all participants will be in listen-only mode. Today's presentation is slated for approximately 45 minutes, with 15 minutes at the end for questions. Our panel of speakers will be taking questions throughout the session via the questions widget. Please type in questions during the presentation and click submit. If your question is of immediate import or concerns technical problems, you will receive an immediate answer by text. You can also find a widget entitled Resources, where you can download assets provided by the speakers and sponsors for each webinar. Just click the resource in the box and it will be automatically downloaded. If you are interested in receiving CLE or CE accreditation for this program, you must stay on for the full duration of the webinar and answer 3 polling questions that will appear during the course of the program. Additionally, please fill out the participant information questions. This will ensure that you are correctly matched to the state and professional organization. As a reminder, this webcast is being recorded. After the presentation, you will receive an archive link for further review or for sharing. The webinar will also be available for future viewing on our website. Again, thank you for joining the Net Diligence Virtual Cyber Risk Summit. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to our friends across the globe. I wish you all the best in both mental and physical health during these certainly tough times. My name is Timmel. I'm the National Director of Cyber Risk Insurance at Safety National, a Tokyo Marine Group company. We have a group of fantastic panelists today to discuss how their respective organizations undertake efforts to predicting a breach. The first thing I'd like to do is actually have the panelists introduce themselves. So we'll start with Payal.
Hi, everyone. My name is Payal Patel. I lead the Northeast E&O and Cyber team for Marsh. I've been at Marsh for the past 5 years and in the insurance industry for a total of 10.
Manish, can we have you jump in?
Hi, everyone. I'm Manish Karir. I'm the Vice President for the FICO Cyber Risk Score. At FICO, I work on developing the Cyber Risk Score and bringing it to market.
And James.
Hi, good morning or good evening to everyone. My name is James Perry. I'm a Senior Director for Incident Response for CrowdStrike Services. I lead our incident breach response services globally for CrowdStrike.
And last but not least, Tim.
Hey everyone, my name is Tim Nunziata, and I run the cyber risk and commercial E&O portfolio at Nationwide. Been with Nationwide about 11 years now, and in the industry going on 17. Thank you guys.
All right, now we have actually 3 polling questions throughout the presentation that we're going to use. The first one here is predicting a breach is super easy. It's improving. Truly impossible. Or none of the above. So we're going to pause for about 15 more seconds to allow time for you folks to answer this polling question. All right, thank you very much. We'll move on. Agenda, really what we want to talk through is, why predicting a breach matters. We'll get Payal to talk through a broker perspective, chat a little bit about current predicting tools, specifically predicting for certain classes of business versus predicting from a tactical view standpoint. We'll then pass it back to Tim from a carrier perspective, and then finish up with the future and how to improve these types of predicting tools. Actually, just going to open it up to all of our panelists for this next slide here, and really talk through why predicting a breach matters. From a personal perspective, most of our efforts related to a breach are truly reactionary, and breaches with the tremendous hard and soft costs, any way to predict the frequency of severity, frankly, will allow businesses to focus on their core competencies and their true business, opposed to the burden of cyber type of events. So I do want to kind of open it up to the panel. Payal, why do you believe predicting a breach matters?
Sure. So in our experience on the broker side, especially with dealing with some of the largest claims in the industry, we find most bad actors don't initially get into the system where the critical assets lie. They get into a system that they can exploit, and they move laterally throughout the network to get to the critical assets or the file server or the sensitive info, or maybe the central point in which to distribute ransomware attacks across the entire system for the organization. So predicting a breach, or making sure that you understand your threat environment and you're mitigating against that, and you detect the breach instantaneously, is really going to help mitigate the long-term harm. So that's why I think predicting a breach really matters from a client perspective.
Okay, Manish or James or Tim, thoughts on why predicting a breach matters?
Yeah, I think one of the important things I wanted to mention here is what we actually mean when we say predicting a breach, right? We're not trying to say that an incident is going to take place at the following named organization at 8 p.m. tomorrow evening, right? That's not what predicting a breach means, in my opinion. It's more of a statistical-based approach at estimating the risk probabilities, and that really is, it's a statistical prediction rather than a pointed named prediction.
Okay, great.
Yeah, I would agree. This is Tim Nunziata, and I think from the carrier side, we view two aspects of this. There's the proactive approach, kind of getting away from that reactionary breach response by identifying these vulnerabilities, certain areas of exposure, and providing front-end solutions and conversations with these clients to help shore up some of those concerns. It also enables us to work with the brokers to provide coverage that's appropriate, that the coverage they need versus all of the coverage that's out there. But then, when it comes to that reactionary response, it enables us to provide a more streamlined approach to that. If we can identify certain areas of concern, we can ensure that we have the resources available to respond to any incident, not only from a general perspective, and I'll get into it a little more specifically later, but as we continue to evaluate data, we realize that certain industries respond differently or have different areas of concern or ways to approach things. So it enables us to refine, not only be more prepared, but to refine that response as well.
Yeah, and I think this is James from CrowdStrike. When it comes to predicting a breach, a lot of people think about using alerts or detections that are occurring in your environment as part of predicting a breach. Activity that's occurring, whether it's malware or users receiving phishing emails, and you really have to take a step back and look at predicting a breach around events that are occurring in your environment, events that are occurring in the world. Are there new vulnerabilities that have just been released for major vendors? Do those vulnerabilities exist in your environment? Can those vulnerabilities lead to access to sensitive data that would lead to a breach? So you have to take that step back and take that holistic approach to understanding not only what's happening in the world, but how does that affect your current environment in your company, and can that lead to a breach down the road? And I will talk to that a little bit more later in the presentation.
Great, folks. That's fantastic. So let's try to get the next slide here. Let's try to get let's get a little bit more granular from each one of the panelists. So, Payal, let's start with from a broker perspective. Slide number 7 here. thoughts on how do your clients currently predict a breach, and what tools are they using to support your clients?
Yeah, sure. So I think James mentioned this perfectly. When we talk about predicting a breach for our clients, it's all about understanding the threat environment that is impactful to them, right? So it's understanding the threat actors, it's understanding the industry vulnerabilities, it's understanding supply chain vulnerabilities, and how changes in technology are going to expand some of those vulnerabilities within their environment. And then relaying processes, procedures, and plans to make sure that detection, mitigation, and resiliency plans are going to be there in the time of crisis. So when it comes to how Marsh handles that for clients, we really focus on getting clients to understand their threat environment prior to working with a carrier like Nationwide to go ahead and secure the insurance piece of what we want covered when the worst actually happens. When we work through the submission, it's not just simply how many records you have and how large you are in terms of size. It's a more granular and detailed process to understand where your critical assets really lie, how you're protecting those critical assets, what failover capabilities you have, and what protections you have around operational technology and other elements that the policy has now been extended to cover, given what our new threat actors are really going after, which is not often just financial damage. It's sometimes just disruption to your entire system. It could be e-crime, it could be hacktivism, it could be a nation-state attack. And so when we take a look at things like the Marsh Cyber Assessment, or you can even look at the AIG assessment, those types of assessments and portals are going to help clients really dig deeper into a true understanding of their risk, a true understanding of their threat environment, what capabilities they have now, how that compares to peers across their industry size and location, what they can do better in terms of a scoring platform, and we typically score them based on the NIST framework. So we'll give them a response score, we'll give them a detect score, we'll give them a recovery score. And then it's really overlaying that with all of the processes and plans that they have internally to make sure that when the worst does happen, they're going to mitigate it. So that's why we have the prevention versus resiliency bullet here. It's not about preventing the attack in its totality. It's making sure that if we truly believe as an industry this is a when and not if incident, we're going to make sure that we have the ability to detect the attack, and if the attack actually happens, we have the resiliency capabilities to continue to keep the business up and running. Then when we overlay that with the underwriting community and the client community, I've seen clients, in addition to completing something like the Marsh self-assessment to get a better understanding of their risk, they also learn from peer data, they learn from claims data, and really the key is building that culture within the client environment to make sure that every single individual within the client environment understands the stakes that security holds and really believes that they should be participating in it to make sure that the organization is actually protecting itself from all elements of a bad act or bad actor. And then from the underwriting community, we certainly see underwriters like Tim ask our clients questions specific to their industry. So if we're talking about a retail, it would be more about the PCI environment or POS environment, or if we're talking about healthcare, it might be a little bit more geared towards ransomware. Same with municipalities, and asking the right questions to make sure that they have the right capabilities to protect against the actual attack in the event that it happens.
Okay, very interesting. And let's move on to the next slide here, predicting tools. Just going to really open this one up to the group to talk a bit about predictive analytics and current predicting tools, and then we'll go more specifically into the FICO and the CrowdStrike platforms. Thoughts on predictive analytics and how that certainly is going to, or how it currently supports predicting a breach topic?
Sure, this is Tim Nunziata. As far as the predictive analytics are concerned, it's really, it says here, filtering the noise. I mean, we are really trying to refine those analytics. I think that as we continue to as the market continues to expand, as more loss data comes in and claims information, we have a better sense of filtering through that and really identifying, what those true indicators are. Where is the causality coming from? What is, truly the relevant data here? And I think, an example of that, we talk a lot about, revenue as the indicator for the size of the organization. And as we continue to gather more data and refine those analytics, we start to realize that maybe that's a little more complex. It's about evaluating the size of the exposure versus the size of the company. And, we don't have enough information to provide the true context we need to evaluate all of this. So the important part is to be flexible and to continue to, overlay additional information as we get that to make sure that we're looking at the appropriate information. It's all about the quality versus the quantity here, and we continue to improve that quality, but we still have a long way to go there.
Tim, I agree with you, but I think we've also moved from taking a look at the tools that have the outside-in view to really asking questions so clients think about the inside view more, right? So the protective capabilities as opposed to just, the general scans that are done across the organization to say if they fall in a low, medium, or high category of risk. I've certainly seen that change from the underwriting community as well.
Yeah, I would agree with that, and it's a collective. It's the collective approach here, right? It's not analyzing one set of data or from one perspective. It's taking the inside out, the outside in view from the underwriter perspective, from the client perspective, and creating a more holistic picture of what that exposure looks like and what that risk looks like. I agree.
Yeah, and I think, at the end of the day, this is an ever-changing threat landscape, and the risk profiles of the specific insureds is changing really very rapidly too. So, it is nice to see, Payal, that to your comment, that the insurance industry and the brokerage community and technology companies have actually come together over the last 5+ years to advance the efforts to predicting a breach and to manage this exposure more effectively. Manish, I'm going to pass it over to you on this next slide to really talk about the FICO tool. Before we do that, sorry about that, Manish. Before we do that, we have another polling question. Predicting a breach or predicting causality is important because clients can improve on known vulnerabilities. It allows coverage to be properly tailored to fit the needs of the insured, or it can streamline and improve overall incidents, or all of the above. So we'll pause here for a second, if you wouldn't mind selecting one of these for our poll. All right, Manish, I'm going to pass it off to you to talk about how FICO manages detecting a breach.
Yeah, thanks, Spencer. So one of the things that I wanted to mention related to the previous discussion here is there's really two parts to this prediction of risk question. The first part is objective, right? This is going to be something that is going to be based on data, statistics, things that can be measured at scale. And then there's a subjective side of this, and the two really have to be combined to build a holistic view of true risk at an organization. For the cyber risk score today, I'm going to focus on the objective analysis. So this is the risk analysis that can be performed at organizations at scale across the world based on signals that are going to be visible to everybody, because the subjective information is going to vary, right? This is equivalent to having an understanding that there are certain, for example, age factors that relate to the credit score or the riskiness of certain clients, whether it's for automobile accidents or other risk evaluations that takes place. And then there are subjective analysis for particular individuals, such as understanding their specific conditions, which may modify what the objective analysis or the overall statistics say about the risk. So on the next slide here, I'm going to talk about briefly, what the FICO, and then we'll step through at a high level to try to give people an understanding of why it works inherently, so that people have an intuitive understanding of why the numbers are and what makes them tick. So the FICO Cyber Risk Score is an empirical assessment of breach risk for an organization. It's based on historical data of data breaches to the extent that that is available, and it's a prediction of the likelihood of a significant breach event. So the outcome of the score actually represents risk odds, right? The probability of an adverse event taking place at an organization. It's represented on a score of 300 to 850, and higher scores are better, just like the FICO credit score. And on the high end, organizations scoring 850 are about 25 times less likely to have an adverse event take place than organizations scoring at 300. Now, once again, these scores are representing risk at a statistical level. They represent populations taken together, and a lot of this is powered by algorithms and techniques that were developed at FICO for the credit score. The methodology is the same. Data is totally different. The objective functions are different, but the mindset that goes behind it is the same, and it really comes down to trying to understand behaviors at an organization. Now, what do I mean when I talk about cyber behaviors at an organization, and what are the data signals you can pick up? So if we look at the next slide here, I'll talk through some of those interesting things that you can pick up. So we focus on collecting large amounts of data across the entire internet. We're going to be collecting billions of data points about different organizations that exist on the internet, but we try to cluster them to look for specific parts, specific subsections. So we're going to look for endpoint behaviors, which represent IT health and the tendencies that an organization is exhibiting from that perspective. We look for evidence of the network infrastructure being well run. How about the software services? And for a lot of the smaller organizations, there's a lot you can tell just from the way a single web page is structured, whether or not they're following best common practices or not. Now, the reason we're looking at all of these items is because we've shown through research, and I'll talk about this research in just a couple of slides here. We've shown through research that these elements of mismanagement or misconfiguration are correlated with adverse events taking place, with data breaches taking place at organizations. So we measure these signals specifically because we've shown that there's positive correlations between these things, between the tendencies of an organization to make mistakes in basic housekeeping, basic day-to-day maintenance of their systems, and a data breach taking place. So if we talk to the next slide here, I'll talk about how this process of training a machine learning model actually gets built. So we start with the data signals that I talked about, lots of data points, and then we have to, just like for any supervised machine learning algorithm, whether it's training a machine learning model to understand cat pictures versus dog pictures, you go through a training exercise, right? You train your machine learning model saying symptoms A, B, and C. This was evidence of a data breach. C, D, and F, evidence from an organization that did not have a data breach. You repeat this process for thousands of exemplars, and at the end of the process, you have a machine learning kernel that has picked up common symptoms shared by organizations that historically had data breaches and symptoms shared by organizations that did not. And once you have that, then the process of prediction really comes down to looking at these symptoms for any new organization you're looking to score. For any new organization, you ask, tell me what your symptoms are, A, B, and C, and then the machine learning kernel is going to run a comparison with the trained model, and say, well, these symptoms resemble very closely the symptoms of organizations that had data breaches in the past. Therefore, this is a high-risk organization. So if we go into the next slide, I can talk about some of the statistical measures looking for when we're looking at these cyber signals. What did I mean when I said we're looking at symptoms? In general, we're not looking for vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities are not going to be predictive because they represent point failures in time for specific signals. Every organization makes mistakes. Just because they were not aware of a zero-day, which is going to come out next week, doesn't mean that it is a risk organization. What is a high-risk organization is going to be determined by how well they're able to handle and respond to an adverse event. That's going to be the most important metric when it comes to looking at risk. So in our research, we were able to show that simple things that are well understood in the industry about how to manage your infrastructure, whether it's just renewing our SSL certificates on time or looking at best common practices for your DNS servers, just as by way of example, these are two excellent ways to understand the culture, the cybersecurity culture at an organization. And we could show positive correlation with organizations that made mistakes in these areas and that also tended to have data breaches. And then in the next slide, we are able to show that when you paint a diverse set of these kinds of data measurements, you're able to come up with a machine learning model that can achieve very high performance rates. We're looking at upwards of 90% true positive and a 10% false positive rates for these kinds of supervised machine learning models. So it really goes to driving home the point that what prediction really comes about, the success of any prediction in this space really is going to be dependent on understanding behaviors rather than specific point failures or technology failures or trying to anticipate the next technology failure. It's about those cyber social factors. Now, on the next slide, I really wanted to differentiate what I've been talking about with what is a very common view, which is just looking at piles and piles of data, right? We call that the security ratings approach, where you just collect as much information as you can, and it may be all entirely correlated with each other, but you just build a giant data and you say, hey, there's a lot of data here, and you should be able to make a decision based on that. That is a very different approach than the one that we're talking about. We're talking about synthesizing all of those piles of raw data into a decisionable metric. And that decisionable metric really is a quantifiable score because it's based on understanding which of those piles of data actually mattered from a historical perspective, and then using that to break it down, actionable metric rather than looking at 3 or 4 competing metrics, right? So if it's trying to extract useful information from the piles of raw data. And the difference between these approaches is clearly borne out. I mean, on the next slide here, I have an example of between these two different approaches. And, this was a case of an organization using the FICO Cyber Risk Score that had a data breach take place somewhere in the early 2017s. And, according to our score, we had some concerns about the security posture of this organization. And if you were just looking at the piles of raw data, there was no signal there to extract any risk concern. And so the security rating approach would say nothing to be worried about here, even when the data breach occurred and when the data breach was disclosed. That's when the security rating approach corrects itself and says, oh, there's been an incident here. We need to correct this because now everyone knows about this, right? This is not a predictive approach. This is a reactive approach. It's saying a bad incident has taken place. We should adjust the score, rather than the cyber risk score, which was looking at what were the actual symptoms on the ground and whether or not those had changed in order to reflect the security health of an organization.
Well, Manish, that's very interesting. This is Spencer. I appreciate that, and I thank you for your comments. I really find value in, we had mentioned before, filtering the noise. And it sounds like the FICO cyber risk score really filters a lot of the noise out of what just a typical security rating would do. So that's very interesting. Quick question for you though. The rating score has folks in the red and the orange, and I think it was yellow and green. Can you give us a feeling of a breakdown of how many organizations actually fall into that 800 and above or various categories, and does that change between industry class?
It does. In fact, firmographic information is part of what's factored into the score. However, it's important to note that the score represents a metric of risk across industries. So a 550 in one industry class is absolutely comparable to a 550 in a different industry class. So we don't believe in having different scales for industry classes. There's just one scale because that makes it easy to compare and understand objectively two different organizations on a scaling score. There's a distribution between organizations that are rated high risk and organizations that are rated low risk. But in terms of operationalizing this kind of a risk estimate, it really comes down to each organization understanding their risk tolerance. Someone who has a very low risk tolerance would want to set a threshold that's really high. They might want to set a threshold saying anything above 700 is good, anything below 700 is bad, right? Because I really am very, very averse to any risk. Organization that was a little bit more tolerant of the risk might set their own operating threshold lower in order to better manage what they're doing and how they're managing the organizations they're dealing with.
Okay, interesting. One last question for you, and then we'll move on to James' piece that's a more of a tactical view. But how do you see organizations change their score? I mean, can they make significant improvements and say change their score by 100 points or 20, 10, 15, 20, 25%, or is that in your experience has that been a challenge? And in the same vein, have organizations dramatically have their scores dramatically fallen off over a short period of time?
Yeah, that's a great question. Earlier on referenced the NIST standards, and we absolutely reference people back to the 800-53 as a guideline on how people can go about improving their score. And people who follow the policy recommendations in the 800-53 will in general do better in terms of securing their own organizations. We're very careful in this area to make sure people don't misunderstand what the goal is here, right? The goal here is not for people to improve their score. The goal is to improve their cybersecurity posture. The score will then reflect that improved posture, right? Very, very often people tend to get caught up in my goal here is to move the score 50 points. That's not the goal. The goal here is improve posture. The score will follow.
Okay, very interesting. Now we're going to take more of a tactical approach, and we're going to have James from CrowdStrike talk about predicting a breach from their perspective. James, I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you, Spencer. So, as you heard on the FICO presentation, part of the presentation, the FICO cyber risk score focuses really on the industry, how you're doing against others and your peers, and then across the world. What I'm going to talk about now is how you're doing internally. What kind of situational awareness do you have of the current threats to your existing environment? What does a company see when they look at the data being produced by the tool sets that they have? Many security teams today face, challenges from, workers being remote to, too many alerts to having, strategic awareness of what's happening in their environment. As organizations continue to work as individuals, disjointed alerts, you don't understand the risk of all those different alerts and events across your environment, so you act in a very reactionary posture. We've talked a lot today about seeing through the noise. Unless you have the big picture situational awareness, you really can't make strategic security decisions, you can't make resource decisions, and you can't understand what the actual risk right now is to your environment. As many people probably know, security teams see thousands of alerts a day. You get alert fatigue. Analysts may have a tendency to pick up the easier alerts. They want to get through the alerts. They want to bring the number down. But they may not be prioritizing and focusing on which alerts really matter, which ones can really lead to a breach. And that comes back to helping us predict the breach and really leading to the time to investigate. If you have analysts who are looking at 100 alerts and 90 take a minute apiece and 10 take an hour, they're going to start with the minute apiece, but they may not those may not be the ones that will lead to a breach. CrowdStrike, to help organizations figure out what is the best way to work through these alerts, developed a model called CrowdScore. CrowdScore focuses on what is the current organizational threat level. What is it for your environment based on the data from the CrowdStrike sensors that are deployed in your environment? And I'll talk a little bit more about the platform and the type of data that goes into that here in a second. But CrowdScore provides an immediate indication to the current threat level to help your organization prioritize time and resources. It helps security leaders have a simple metric designed to understand the current threat level on a real-time basis. So basically, if your organization is sitting at a 0, you're doing pretty good. There's no current active threat to your environment, and that score moves from a 0 to 100. If you're sitting at 100, that's probably time to be all hands on deck. Fire up that red flare and bring in the right people across your organization to respond to the incidents that are happening so they don't become a breach. We also use CrowdScore to help establish a baseline, give you ability to monitor trends throughout your environment. Maybe in your environment, a 10 is normal. Users are being constantly phished. You have scans hitting your outside environment. You have different alerts that are occurring from drive-by downloads and other events that may occur. So a 10 may be normal. But this can help keep your team informed about what the current threat level is over time. As more and more organizations use a tool like CrowdStrike and have these crowd scores, you can help understand, last week I was a 10, this week I'm a 50. What changed? What do I have to do to bring my score back down to a level in which there's not an existing threat? You can use it not only for status reporting, letting senior executives know it's an easy number to say, hey, we're currently at a 10, last week we were at 50. But you can use it to make strategic decisions on resource engagement. Do you need more level 1 SOC analysts? Do you need additional network people, because that's where the events are coming from? And then when events are high, so you can bring in additional resources, maybe an outside incident response team to help you respond to the threat that's occurring. If you want to move on to the next slide, I'll tell you a little bit about how we do this with the platform. So the CrowdStrike platform is really that. It is a cloud-native platform that gathers data from the endpoints in your environment. And then we can use that data to do a number of different things, whether it's our next-gen antivirus model that helps you detect and prevent threats in your environment, stop malware from running in your network, to device control, where we really focus on keeping users from using a USB drive to remove potentially sensitive data from the endpoints in your environment. Talk about our EDR technology, so endpoint detection and response. That's really the flight recorder that's recording everything that's happening. So if you do have a breach, you can help answer some of those questions about, what led to the breach, what data was accessed, where did the compromised accounts, what systems did they move to? And then moving over to the right, when we really move into our security and IT operations, talking about the IT hygiene. When you're talking about, how do you predict a breach, IT hygiene and vulnerability management are really two key aspects of that. We have seen recently over the last 6 months numerous reports from both from Department of Homeland Security in the U.S., from organizations in Australia and the U.K., talking about the top 10 vulnerabilities that have been released and are being exploited by actors. A number of those exploits focus on externally facing technology, your VPN environment, your VDI environment, ways that users access your environment remotely. Part of CrowdStrike and our platform helps you understand, do those vulnerabilities exist in your environment, and where do they exist without having to do scans, without having to go touch the systems. The data is already there in the platform. And then when we think about IT hygiene, you're talking about things like the number of vulnerabilities that exist, what types of accounts have access to what systems. Really lowering that threat, really lowering the threat attack surface for your environment. That's what these models help us understand and help organizations really secure their environment from the inside out. And then we've talked a lot in this presentation about understanding the threat landscape. With the rise in ransomware, the threat landscape has dramatically changed over the last 18 to 24 months. It used to be actors targeted specific industries, looking for specific types of data for IP theft, for espionage. And with the rise of big game hunting, of enterprise ransomware attacks, the threat environment has risen for organizations that never thought that they would be a target of advanced actors, school systems, state and local governments, healthcare organizations. Part of the platform helps you understand that threat. What does it mean to your environment, even if you are a state and local government, you are a smaller organization that may not have those typical things that actors used to be after, large numbers of records around PII, PHI, payment card information, IP. You have to understand the threat model is now different for all organizations, and that's part of the threat intelligence model here. And the last thing I wanted to talk about is our CrowdStrike store. With the data that we're able to gather from your endpoints, we have enabled partners and other organizations to use that data with your permission as part of their application. So it's not just what CrowdStrike is developing to help secure organizations. Other groups, other companies, other products can take that information and use it in actionable ways that we may not have thought about yet, and really help improve the entire security ecosystem across the world.
All right, James, I appreciate that. That's great. I mean, what I'm hearing is those two platforms, both the FICO and the CrowdStrike, are both accomplishing a pretty good task, but maybe should be used in combination, right? We're not saying when we're predicting a breach that one tool is available and you should use one specific tool, but it is the combination of some broker perspective, from a FICO perspective, a more general look, a more tactical approach from the CrowdStrike folks, and then we're going to pass it on to Tim now to talk a bit about from a carrier perspective. Tim?
Great, thank you. So moving on to that next slide, from an underwriting perspective, the analytics and the predictive analytics enable us to provide context around a certain exposure. Generally speaking, what concerns you about that risk or opportunity, but overlaying these analytics enables us to drill down and say, how does the industry or size or location mitigate or exacerbate certain concerns? And again, providing context to those exposures and ultimately the company's risk profile. And then as we drill down into each of these insureds and from the carrier perspective, renewals or policies, these analytics enable us to strengthen that process across every stage. I think, we talk a lot about the response, but ultimately, it's about mitigating that risk profile and the true partnership with the client and the broker and the insured. And, by identifying potential concerns or vulnerabilities or exposures, it enables us to be proactive in improving the risk profile, whether that's through scans, anti-malware software, tabletop exercises. It's not just about the mitigation, it's also about the preparation and say, hey, these are concerns of ours. How do we go about either resolving them or putting a plan in place that will enable us to manage that, again, when, not if, there may be an issue here. And then from the, renewal process itself, the submission process for underwriters is one of our largest challenges, getting the information we need. Through analytics, we can provide that benchmark approach to certain exposures. We can provide more consistent evaluation of risks based on similar data, and a more informed conversation with the broker and the client enables us to have a smoother renewal, a more informed decision. will be made at that point. And then ultimately, what does that mean on the back end? If there is, a breach, what can we do? And it's not about, we need to make sure we're prepared for all of that. And not every breach and exposure is created equal. So we need to make sure that we can adapt. Do we have the right expertise in a certain industry? Have we discussed potential concerns and how we could, what the response would be to that? How are we aligning resources across the multifaceted response process to create the fastest and most efficient response for our client? And at this point, data analytics specifically has enabled us to, get a sense of certain industry outliers. I mean, we talk about hindsight being 20/20 and looking back on certain exposures and saying, oh, there were certain indicators of that concern here or there. We need to make sure that we're looking forward and identifying those indicators early in the process. And by creating a consistent approach to data analytics and predictive analytics, we can create an equal playing field to a certain extent on how we evaluate those risks. Now, it's certainly improving, and I think every aspect of the process is getting better, but we have a long way to go, and I don't think there is a single solution out there that enables us to appropriately evaluate that exposure. So, from our perspective, we view this as a multifaceted approach. Evaluating exposures and risks and vulnerabilities from multiple angles, and then trying to provide a collective, analysis of what that looks like. Again, every industry size and location is going to be somewhat different. So, certain metrics from one resource may, be mitigated by, analysis of other areas of concern. So, we're continually trying to refine this data. And again, without the extensive claims history and loss data that some of our other products have, it's difficult for us to consistently identify causality of the claim and then shore up that vulnerability. So it's an evolving process, but the tools are improving. And like I said, when we start to overlay some of the resources out there, we can provide a more holistic approach to the risk profile. How do we improve that? And then, as I said, if there is an issue, how can we most efficiently respond?
Yeah, I appreciate those thoughts. From my perspective, from Safety National and underwriting perspective, it's an exciting time, right? I mean, we have, if you look at cyber industry 10 years ago and where we've come from a data analytics standpoint and from predicting a breach standpoint, is very interesting. And frankly, I think the next 10 years is even going to be more enjoyable. So we're all up here on time. I want to pass it right back to each one of the panelists real quick. And just to briefly, maybe in 15 seconds or less, what are the improvements that are needed relative to predicting a breach, or what does the future of predicting a breach mean to you? Payal, we'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So, I agree with Tim in terms of the more data and more intelligence we have, the smarter we're going to be, whether that's from an underwriting perspective or a risk advisory perspective on the broker side. I think a lot of our clients are asking more and more, what does the investment in my security tools do for me from a cyber insurance perspective? So making sure that we get that right and making sure that we're connecting the dots around security vendors that can help with some of the mitigating of the attack or detecting the attack is certainly going to help our clients be smarter and evolve with the ever-changing nature of the integration of technology within each of their industries. So that's certainly something we've been working on through Blue Eye and Cyber Catalyst.
Okay, great. Manish, final thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think what we've spent some time talking about today has been the probability of events, predicting the actual events taking place. And I think that's important, and that's going to only get better over time as more data is made available, more claims information is made available. I think the flip side, the adjacent side to this discussion is also about anticipating the kinds of events, because that's going to be very closely related to the magnitude of potential claims that come in. So the financial modeling part of this is also something that has to to improve. And once again, the ability for organizations such as Net Diligence to pull together some of this claims information and make it available to improve those financial risk models would be tremendously helpful in the future. So the two parts can actually be combined together, the probability and the loss magnitude.
All right, wonderful. James, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think as we move forward in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, the improvements really need to be around information sharing, making sure that the technology community, the insurance community, the legal community are sharing information and data, raw data that can really help us improve, predicting a breach, predicting changes in the threat landscape, and just making it better overall so we all are on the same page about what's coming up. What are we seeing, and what are the threats that are currently being faced by the organizations which we all serve?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, if we really did, between industry classes, shared data and shared it effectively, I mean, exponentially would be the curve relative to being able to predict and quantify an event. Tim, do you have any last thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what everyone says there. I think obviously we need to continue to refine this data, but we need more loss information, and we need to be sharing this data because everyone on this call is evaluating those risks from a different perspective. And that conversation isn't linear. It's almost like putting a puzzle together. And if we can collaborate and talk through, everyone's perspective, it'll enable us to get a better sense of what that picture is going to look like at the end of the day. And to your point, we'll accelerate exponentially, hopefully, our ability to analyze this data. And I think from a coverage perspective, if I could see something impacting it further down the road, again, I feel like we're in very, very early stages of all of this, but, could certain predictive analytics drive coverages, especially as we get into that SME and middle market space that are more tailored to the individual risk versus industry or market standards, if you will. Really from a network security standpoint, right? The cyber policy covering a lot of things right now. As we can, as the product evolves and becomes more refined, hopefully, these analytics are something we can continue to lean on to help drive decision making.
All right, fantastic. So up with our last poll, true or false, prediction tools and assessments have been improved by the use of big data and machine learning. We're going to take about a 20-second pause here. We're going to stop our recording, and then we'll do some live Q&A. So if you wouldn't mind, select our last polling question here, and we'll pause for a brief second. Okay, well now it's time for questions. So if you wouldn't mind sending them in, we look forward to giving you some great responses. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed the presentation. We do have the panelists available for live questions and certainly answers. There are quite a few questions here, and one thing that I thought would be most interesting was to open it up to James and Manish and really ask about effectiveness of their platforms. And is their respective platform more effective, equally as effective, or less effective, depending on the size of an organization? More simply, does your platform translate well to SME business versus large corporations? Manish, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, absolutely. It can be applied to evaluate the risk of small businesses as well as vendors that they are interacting with. In particular, all we are looking for is evidence that an organization has exhibited behaviors that are consistent with good cyber practices and good cyber hygiene. Whether we find those signals from a simple web page that they have for explaining what their business does, or whether we get that signal by doing a complex evaluation of their switches and network infrastructure. The methodology and the approach remains the same. We're looking for just evidence of signals that indicate that an organization knows what it's doing, and that's what's used to compare with historical signals to arrive at a score. James?
Thank you. And, in terms of the CrowdStrike and the CrowdStrike platform, the size of the organization doesn't matter. When we're deploying and looking at the data coming from our sensors, what really matters is that you have full visibility in your environment. Sensors deployed out to all of your endpoints to help us detect, if there is malicious activity or activity that's going to lead up to malicious activity. Deployment of files, placing of, credentials being used that shouldn't be used, that type of activity. So, we're highly effective both at small organizations, SME, things as small as 100, 200 endpoints, to environments that have hundreds of thousands of endpoints. The methodologies that we use, the processes that we use, and the technology that is built into our platform rely on the data that we see, not necessarily the size of the environment.
Okay, and as far as implementation of each of the products, what should somebody in a small business expect from implementing the FICO platform versus the CrowdStrike platform? And then maybe you look at larger corporations too. And if you could touch on evaluation of vendors, which is a key piece. How do we continually assess our vendors? We'll keep it open with Manish and James.
Yeah. So on the FICO score, the offering is built as a SaaS platform, and it provides scores for any organization globally. So you can log in and simply search for the vendor that you're interested in understanding the cyber risk for, and you will obtain a score and a report for any organization globally.
And James, I suspect the CrowdStrike offering is certainly more significant to get up and running, because the tactical approach is maybe, I don't want to say the word intrusive, but certainly from an implementation standpoint may take a little bit more time. Am I incorrect in that?
Yeah, I would say you're slightly incorrect in that one. So I like to term our deployment as simple. When you look at our platform, you see many different modules, but in reality, it's a single agent. It's a single tool that you deploy to your environment to gather the data that supports all of those modules in which I talked about. One of the things that I always like to use is metrics around organizations. We've had small organizations deploy in minutes to every single one of their endpoints. We also have had organizations deploy over 100,000 sensors in 24 hours with no issues. So it is a very fast process. I do it weekly with my team, daily really with my team, as part of incident response engagements for organizations small and large, where we're deploying our platform to environments as fast as possible, because somebody has predicted a breach or there is a breach in an environment, and we're trying to get that visibility to stop any further damage.
Okay, great. So I think we have time for one more question. It looks like we have about 90 seconds left. I think it's very interesting aspect relative to sharing of breach information and sharing of threats, that kind of thing. Any thoughts on how we advance threat sharing, breach intel from private to public businesses to really start to continue to, like we mentioned before, get the noise out of this predicting type stuff. So thoughts on information sharing and where that will lead us in the near future?
Yeah, Manish, James.
Yeah, thanks, James.
So I think when it comes to information sharing, it's critical going forward to help secure a wide range of organizations that we're sharing information. And that's not just indicators, IPs, domains, and hashes. That is sharing the tactics that actors are using. That is sharing, what they're doing today, not necessarily what they were doing 6 months ago, since actors are changing very quickly. We've built a lot across the world, siloed information sharing organizations by industry, by type of organization that the company is. That is actually, in my opinion, hurting what we're doing now, since actors, especially ransomware actors and nation-state and nation-state actors, are industry agnostic. They're after types of data. So, we may be sharing data effectively with, say, the FS ISAC that doesn't get shared with the retail ISAC or with the state and local government ISAC, but it's the same actors targeting all those organizations. So we have to be more aggressive about sharing data widely, publicly, and then also sharing, the type of information that we gather with Falcon, that we may gather with the FICO the FICO score, cyber risk score. Sharing that information among industries, between the insurance industry, the legal industry, technology industry, can really help us both predict a breach, but also make organizations better defended.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, James. I certainly appreciate that. That brings us to our close. So thank you very much for the panelists. Certainly appreciate your expertise. And if there's any questions following, please don't hesitate to reach out directly to us. Thanks again to the Net Diligence team, and everybody be safe and healthy. Thank you very much.